Welcome to the first session of Kiev Connection for this year. Thanks for joining us. Today's topic is governing diversity and differences. My name is Chris Martin. I'm the Associate Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, and we're so pleased to co-sponsor this series with our colleagues and friends at the Kiev School of Economics and at Harvard's Ukrainian Research Institute. Today, we have two wonderful speakers and a wonderful moderator for this conversation. So let me take a minute to introduce them to you. So we have Jennifer Brick Murtasashvili, who is the founding director of the Center for Governance and Markets and a professor at the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. She's a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a distinguished scholar of peace and international order at the Institute for Humane Studies, and a contributing editor at National Interest magazine. She is the author of several books, including Informal Order and the State in Afghanistan, and has conducted policy research for USAID, the World Bank, the U.S. Department of Defense, the UNDP, and on and on. She's also a board member at the Collins Institute for Abrahamic Heritage and a member of PONAR's Eurasia, amongst many other things. We also have with us Alexandra Koidel, who's an associate professor and the founding director of the Center for Democratic Resilience at the Kiev School of Economics. She's a fellow at the Center for East European and International Studies and an affiliate of the Center for Governance and Markets at the University of Pittsburgh. She studies democratic transformation and societal resilience with a focus on Ukraine's local governance. She has a PhD in political science from Free University of Berlin, and she has been a visiting researcher at Harvard University, George Washington, NYU, and Sodertorn University. She combines academic research with policy consulting on open government and public integrity for international organizations such as the Council of Europe, IIEP, UNESCO, and we're glad that she's here. And finally, we have our moderator today, my colleague Emily Channel Justice, who is the director of the Temirty Contemporary Ukraine program at Harvard's Ukrainian Research Institute. She's a sociocultural anthropologist who's been doing research on Ukraine since 2012, including work on political activism and social movements among students and feminists during the Euromaidan mobilizations. Her ethnography, Without the State, Self-Organization and Political Activism in Ukraine, was published in 2022, and her edited volume, Decolonizing Queer Experience, LGBT plus Narratives from Eastern Europe and Eurasia, was published in 2020. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily with our thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for your contributions in organizing this event. Thank you for the lovely introductions. I'll just say a couple of words about the significance of this conversation. Many of you know that in the previous semester, Alexandra Koidel was one of our fellows at the Ukrainian Research Institute, and we've had a couple of great events with her featuring some of her research related to this topic. And the original idea for this conversation came out of the panel of the 2025 Teacup conference that she moderated, which focused a lot on kind of the role of new technologies and digitization in democracy and governance. And so I'm really looking forward to kind of building on some of the things we learned about Ukraine's sort of very impressive leadership in some of the realm of governance, and specifically drawing on the immensely important reforms related to decentralization. So I think I'm going to just kind of keep it there so that we can hear about this new research that Dr. Koidel and Dr. Brick Murtasashvili, excuse me, sorry, I should have practiced more, have been working on, and then we'll have a great conversation with them afterwards. So thank you both so much for being here, and we're really looking forward to having you.
So great. Thank you so much, for this really wonderful opportunity to share our work with you. And really, this was the work of Alexandra and her incredible team at Kiev School of Economics, who have done really just remarkable field work over the past year and years on this topic. I mean, our project together has been but a small slice of the incredible research that Alexandra and her entire team and all of KSE has been doing in recent years on this important topic which is on decentralization, local governance. And for us at the Center for Governance and Markets, we've run a research project over the past 3 years called Governing Deep Differences. And the purpose of the project was to explore how individuals and communities around the world are dealing with our polarized world. And the hypothesis that we run with is that, every society finds itself, I think, in these days, for many reasons, polarized and divided increasingly. But the way that societies deal with this really varies across different contexts. And what we wanted to explore was the way that individuals and communities dealt with deep division, rather than just looking to the top or to the central government for solutions, as we often do when we are facing, problems that are really wicked or perplexing. And so the project that Alexandra and her team carried out in Kyiv and throughout Ukraine was part of a cross-national project where we've done research here in the United States on divisions in Rust Belt communities, in Uzbekistan, in Romania, and in Israel, looking at religious communities and how they have overcome these challenges during times of civil conflict. So what we'd like to do today is, just spend some time talking to Alexandra about the incredible work that her team has done on this issue. And so now that you have a little bit of background about the topic, I thought I'd just throw the microphone over to Alexandra just to ask you a few questions about the broad contours of the questions that you were asking, and then maybe just to get into a little bit, I'll probe you a little bit more on the methods that you were using and how you define certain things. But from your perspective, could you talk a little bit about how you conceptualized this research and then how you began to really operationalize it?
So thank you very much for having me here and for agreeing, and Emily and Jennifer agreeing to really discuss this topic. And I have to say that I've been really looking forward to a way of having this wonderful researchers, Emily and Jennifer, somehow, talk to each other. And I'm really great that this is now happening online and that we are somehow connecting to Ukraine. So I want to say that actually I got very inspired in my research and Jennifer's work on Afghanistan and the idea of how important local governance is for all kinds of societal and political transformations. And starting from there was a lot of thinking. And once Jennifer, I've been working or in contact with CGM for several years now. And when it came to the opportunity to jump on to this research as one of the cases, of course, I was really excited. And our team said yes. And now coming down to your question regarding what we were actually doing. So in our research, in our conceptualization of the main question regarding how societies and communities deal with polarization, the first thing in Ukraine, which we had to think about, is that we are really not there yet. So we cannot say Ukraine is a polarized society. In fact, there was a very interesting vignette-based survey study conducted by Timothy Brick and the Sociological Center at the Kyiv School of Economics, where they probed potential field or potential themes of polarization, which would have been the language use, adherence to different types of Orthodox churches, and someone being abroad, someone being in Ukraine, and a few others. And according to the standard measures of polarization, Ukrainian society is not polarized. At the same time, we do have differences, and the war and all kinds of distributional conflicts around war issues can be that trigger. And that's why we started looking at diversity as something that is like a ground, a foundation that can be used for polarization. And when I say we, I want to also mention my colleague Tetiana Luqueira, who is a sociologist in my team, and she has a great, she has a great connection to communities, and together with her, we conceptualized this study. So what we did, we looked at 4 types of diversity. One religious, another ethnic, and another we call social status diversity. So that is communities with a high percentage of internally displaced people and communities with veterans of the current Russo-Ukrainian war. And we selected 9 cases that are distributed in the several regions of Ukraine based on the criteria of what we could collect from the desk research. For example, we have very ethnically diverse regions, which is the Zakarpattia or Transcarpathia sometimes called, and Odessa region. So we selected municipalities there, and with the same logic. And then we asked, we followed there Elinor Ostrom with the idea of a bright side research, because we know so many things don't work. So we wanted to see actually what works. And we used all our previous corpus of information and data about different municipalities in Ukraine. And we could see which ones are dealing how with these types of diversity. And we started then looking deeper in what they are doing in these particular cases. I can then probably speak in more detail about the cases, but that is generally our approach. Methodologically, in terms of data collection, Tetiana Luqueira did the bulk of the field work. She visited these municipalities. We ran also focus groups, and we had interviews with the representatives of the local authorities and of the civil society in these communities. Probably what is also interesting there, in some cases, we even had to overcome certain distrust of people even to talk to us, and Tetiana did a great job convincing people, okay, we are not trying to make you like the authorities. All we want to know is how things are really. And in focus groups, we organized always 2 types of focus groups. So with the people who belong to that diversity group, let's say, and the people who represent a broader community to see, and then we matched the perceptions.
So as you were doing this work, what surprised you the most? That's one of the questions I love to ask, is because we go into so much of our research with assumptions and hypotheses, but what really surprised you?
What really surprised me is how Ukrainian communities deal with religion. Ukraine, there is a big sensitive topics around belonging to several Orthodox churches. So some of our viewers might know that Ukraine has a plethora of Ukrainian Orthodox churches, and one of the most well-known is so-called Kiev Patriarchy. And then there is another church which directs its authority line to Moscow, which is formerly was called the Moscow Patriarchy. And when you look at the public discourse and the media, it seems like there's really a lot of tension, and there have been cases of when communities would, let's say, take over the churches or try to oust the priests from the Moscow Patriarchy. But on the other hand, in some of our communities, it wasn't the case at all. And there were 2 different solutions to that, which are very interesting. So one solution is members of this community, this religious community, and other religious communities, they were rebuilding a historical church, which was from the Ukrainian or so-called Kiev Patriarchy. But even the Moscow Patriarchy belongers, they actually joined the rebuilding effort. And the reason for that is because of their sense of belonging to this particular community and importance of the historical legacy of this community. So one way we can see when people are feeling the belonging to this place and the history and the legacy, it helps them overcome this kind of difference. And another way of dealing with it, which is a bit more widespread, is the members of the Ukrainian of this Orthodox Church, former Moscow Patriarchy. They feel that now is maybe not a good time, and they a little bit seal themselves off of the community. And they do it not because they're ousted, but because they don't want to create additional tension. And they even show understanding that there could be this feeling of negativity because of their belonging. But many, Tatiana actually went to some of these churches, she went to services, and she said that many are, as for example, in their liturgies, they speak for the Ukrainian soldiers. And so what we find is that in practice, the divisions on this front are not necessarily that sharp, and it's not necessarily so black and white, and communities find ways to accommodate.
So could you talk a little bit more about that, about the strategies that communities use to employ this? And I think this goes back to maybe some of the ways that you define cohesion, some of the different ways that you describe like mutual aid, belonging, shared identity, some of the things that came out of the research.
Yes, I'm happily share it. Especially, I must say, I have a favorite community. It's located in Odessa region, and it's called Suvorovo. It is an ethnically diverse community. On the one hand, it has people live of ethnic background, Bulgarian, Romanian, Ukrainian, and it's a village community that where each village is sort of structured or sealed off based on their ethnicity. Now I have to make a little bit of a context because Ukraine went through the decentralization reforms, which started in 2014-15, and administrative reform was completed in 2020 before the municipal elections. And as a result, the lowest administrative unit we have now is called Hromada, and these units are self-governed. They have certain financial fiscal autonomies. They have a political autonomy. They have directly elected mayors and councils. And they have a plethora of competences in education, as healthcare, local development, and utilities, and so on. And once this Suvorovo community is very interesting because it and the way how these municipalities or hromadas were formed was very different. Sometimes it was just several settlements coming together, but in this particular case, it was several districts, which are one level higher in administrative hierarchy, have been split, and fragments of 3 different districts were brought together as a completely new hromada, a completely new institution. And the people who formed it, they have no previous experience before their amalgamation in the local government. And one of the forces that tried to prevent it, they were trying to play the ethnic card. They said, oh, the mayor is actually Bulgarian, so he will not be good to the Romanians. But the team of the mayor, they did a lot of communication, usually face-to-face. It's a village community, and their job was to convince they will not be doing it, and they will be trying to be fair to all ethnicities. And they won elections. And this particular community said, and for the mayor's team, it's very important to always underline that diversity, and this cultural diversity, is their strength. It's a little bit like a rainbow nation of Nelson Mandela in miniature. And they have Hromada days or community days where they showcase their cultures. They mutually eat their food. They talk to each other. And that is one of their really main tools how to stick together. Obviously, there is also financial decisions that are made that are aiming at equity. Plus, what also this community is doing well is that it is supporting local business in being self-sufficient. And they formed the first ever in Ukraine association of water users, which people who, it's agricultural community, so they need water for irrigation, and they own now the infrastructure, and they manage this infrastructure, co-funded it, and the state basically transferred this down to this association of water users. And it's really an innovative institutional solution of how this local infrastructure can be in the hands of the local communities and the actual users. So, and actually, and the second one, you mentioned belonging, we noticed with Tatiana that when Russia has invaded Ukraine in 2022 with a full-scale invasion, this particular community also started, for them, helping the Ukrainian army is something that unites them, because they also know that Ukraine is a polity in which they can coexist in a cohesion. You know, they will, and they are free to express also their cultures.
So one of the reasons that we thought Ukraine was so important to study, I mean, of course, the full-scale invasion, we all saw the response of citizens to what happened. It was really so remarkable in so many ways, but also because of the very innovative nature of the decentralization reforms in Ukraine is also something unlike we've seen in a lot of other contexts. The fact that after 2014, after Maidan, there was this rapid move to reform, that the Hromadas were created quite quickly, but they were also created through this really innovative way that is so rare in the panoply of local governance, that I work on in different contexts, that the communities were actually allowed the autonomy to decide what is your unit. Normally, this is decided from above, and in many other places, it's the central government that tells you, or corruption, for example, fighting corruption was one of the rationales for the creation of the Hromadas, among other reasons, that corruption is so often reproduced when power is decentralized, or when decentralization is introduced to a community, because the players at the district level, for example, or at the mayor's level remain the same. It's just the process that selects them is different, or the accountability that selects them is different. But the fact that you have these existing institutions in place yields a lot of path dependence, and in many cases, it's not always positive. So in Ukraine, the ability of communities had the ability to self-amalgamate. Not all could, or not all chose to. But can you talk a little bit about how that decentralization process affected the outcomes that you're describing, and how people understood that decentralization process? Did everyone understand it as a positive thing, or were some people, not necessarily so convinced?
Right. So the interesting part, you're right, it was really an innovative process. And part of the innovation was also that self-amalgamation was connected to financial incentive. So municipality or settlements, let's say, that amalgamated through a certain time window, they were given from the state a development transfer. And so it did motivate some of the municipalities. On a very general scale, we can say that municipalities, Hromadas that amalgamated earlier, they're generally doing better in almost all outcomes we're interested. Something like resilience, or also financial resilience, because of how I explain it is because you have this social capital. You have enough people who were moving and pushing the amalgamation, and that is the people who were also interested in pushing the economy and civic life in these municipalities. So that's how they're doing. The thing is, sometimes it's also not so clear-cut, because once municipalities were amalgamated by 2018-19, then some of them got additional territories which had been left out completely. So by 2020, many municipalities ended up with territories that they initially weren't planning or didn't want, or maybe there were even local conflicts. So I would say this effect has been a bit downplayed by this forced amalgamation. But it was necessary because of the local elections, because you couldn't have had elections in partly amalgamated and partly unamalgamated territories. At the same time, I also want to comment on the issue of public integrity and corruption and anti-corruption. So the main result of decentralization is that we have a polycentric system. They are autonomous units that make a lot of independent decisions. Obviously, it's not a federal system, but they are quite self-governed. And it means we have diversity. We have everything. So, for example, Max Bada, he did a research in about 2018-19. He did find that in some cases, we had exactly the result that you described. So local oligarchs captured. But there was a window of opportunity which was used by progressive forces, for example, like this municipality I just described, where they completely turned the balance of power. And some of these municipalities even started to be very active participants of programs for the National Agency of Corruption Prevention, for example, training. So they proactively started to improve their governance. And we conducted a study together with the National Agency for Corruption Prevention on corruption in education. And we see how there is an impetus to improve governance from this reform. Some use it, some not, but where it is used, we get the good results. And that is the most important for me.
So, if I want to just take a step back for a second and think about you described the different kinds of social cohesion that you found during the work. But one of the things I found really interesting, a comment that you'd made was that social cohesion, well, in earlier conversations, right, that social cohesion is important, and there's a lot of mobilization during the war. You also note that, like, during COVID and other acute crises, there was also a lot of social cohesion and solidarity and people working together. Do you think that it makes a long-term difference? Or is this something that fades very quickly, that people sort of forget? That can future governance, for example, plans, really be based on this kind of cohesion? Because in the research, you also talk about volunteer burnout. You talk about sort of loss of institutional memory, that people are also going through a traumatic time. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so it's a really, I would say, it's a very difficult question to answer because we don't have an end point how long the social cohesion should stay. So we simply don't know. We want it to stay as long as we want, but we really don't know how much and how long. What we see, however, is if we take Ukraine, the communities where they have formed some forms of social cohesion, which means that they work together, they move to certain common goals, they do it for quite a lengthy period of time. I can give you an example of the city of Lviv. It's a rather big city, it's a regional center, but they started 2006, even before the decentralization reform. There have been groups of local authorities, people, representatives, civil society representatives, education representatives, and business representatives who formed a vision for the future. And they were now working to make the city the IT center of Ukraine and even Eastern Europe, and to make it a tourist attraction. And basically, they put a lot of effort into bringing also the population with them. And even though the city is full of very, very critical people, and maybe it's one of their successes, but we can see that For example, over all these years, they reached those goals. And currently, the city has become a really innovative hub for different medical solutions, which is, again, it's not the city as an authority doing it, but it is a cross-sectoral cooperation between local business, local NGOs, and local authority. So I can say that this, and by the way, these networks that have formed through the years of solving their problem of we want to be a tourist center or economic development, they were repurposed to answer to the challenges of the full-scale invasion. And this resulted then in this, in Lviv being one of the best medical centers of Ukraine for the wounded and for wounded civilians and military personnel. So I can really say that is, since we're dealing basically this social cohesion is result of human networks. So once they establish and trust is built, this can be very lengthy, and it is harder to break it also.
So I want to ask you about IDPs, because it's also something, it's a very important issue in Ukraine. And you did mention that there was sort of a variation in the integration of IDPs from 2014 and to those after the full-scale invasion. And then you also noted a really interesting finding that there was more integration of IDPs in rural areas or in villages than in cities. If my memory serves me correct, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And to me, that's a very fascinating finding and contradicts a lot of what we see in other places. And there's a lot about Ukraine that contradicts what we've seen in other places. And it's why it's such an important case for us to really understand, because of all of the institutional innovations that we've seen, not just the institutional innovations, but the societal response, on so many different dimensions. Ukraine has really proven itself to be quite unique. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that issue of return migration. Or migration in general and return migration.
Yes, sure. I think my internet is, do you, oh, sorry, my internet was lagging a little bit, but I hope I understood the question. No, I will, one moment, I will switch to a different internet. Hello, I apologize for this. Can you hear me now?
We see you. We see you.
Great. Right. So regarding the situation with internally displaced people, which is IDPs, you're somewhere in the middle. So what we find is that small towns are those where integration works the best. And what we find is for two reasons. First, local authorities in small towns, they lack human resources, and we know cities, small towns, cities like Kopychincy and Drohobych and Novovolinsk, who have been very strategic once they understood that internal displacement is their chance to fill out certain positions in the local authority or to bring certain types of business. They were very proactive, and we know stories. My favorite is perhaps the city of Kopychincy, because they wanted to get some production, and they learned that there is a furniture factory in the eastern Ukraine that needs relocation, and they used they actually hired a wedding photographer to make nice pictures of the production of the hangers they could use for production and advertise it across Ukraine for businesses who need to relocate. And once they learned that there's a furniture business, they were even more proactive to do it, because they have a vocational school that produces this type of workers. And I have many other stories where these people, I don't know, sports, someone to lead a sports department was needed, and they understood that, well, we might get them from Eastern Ukraine, the people who relocate. And that is, again, we come to self-governance, because these municipalities, they established their own way of collecting data about the people who arrived in their municipality. They were asking them for their expertise and their for what they can do, and then they contacted them and tried to find to match them with jobs, which there's a lot in Western Ukraine, especially in the small cities. In the very large cities like Kyiv, unfortunately, the integration is very problematic. I'm sorry, there is a error alert. I have to go. I will be in 2 minutes. I'm very sorry.
So not a problem at all. Alexandra, we just hope you and everyone there are safe. Chris, I don't know if Emily, I would just love to use this as an opportunity to engage with you on this, given the remarkable work that you've done on similar topics. Just want to know if you have any comments or thoughts on what you've heard so far.
Well, I decided to jump on and kind of pick up on this thread about internal displacement, as that's my current research topic as well. And I've spoken with Alexandra actually at length about this particular topic in these small communities and this sort of specific focus on economic integration. This may be very common knowledge for folks who are tuning in. But one of the really recurring things in discussion about displacement and kind of dealing with internal displacement, it's people need jobs and people need housing, and these things are deeply connected, right? In places like Lviv, there's a lot of potential there's a lot of potential for, economic development, but housing can be kind of scarce. And in fact, there was a lot of evidence of people sort of jacking up prices once IDPs started flooding to new areas. And it was really difficult. A lot of people discussed kind of having a lot of hard time finding jobs. And I spoke with a woman who worked with those displaced people. She was based in Kramatorsk. This was a few years ago doing research, who said, it's exactly what Alexandra is saying. These small communities actually really make sense because there's this possibility for real integration. Smaller communities need more economic influx, right? And at the same time, they actually have the potential to have a little bit more diverse housing stock. However, at the same time, some of these smaller towns also might have a real absence of available housing. There might have to be a much greater investment in possible housing opportunities, and social housing for IDPs has been a huge issue. What's affordable housing for IDPs? I hope you don't mind, Alexandra.
Yeah.
I jumped in a little bit with some of my own work.
And Emily, just along those lines, I just want to ask you one more question before we jump back to Alexandra to give her a second to catch her breath. Could you, your book, which is a classic, and I hope everyone here has read it. For those of us who work on self-governance or who, who begin their research with an assumption that people are actually really creative and have the ability to solve problems. I teach public policy, and one of the things that's always important to remember about public policy I teach my students is that the study of public policy is always about the study of imperfect alternatives. There is no perfect organization. There is no perfect state. There is no perfect community. It's about understanding and balancing, comparing the differences between the alternatives. And your book on self-organization and Maidan, I think, really helped set the stage for helping us understand what's happened in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion. And I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit about that, your expectations. You were there for, when you saw and you wrote about laying the groundwork for all of these reforms. Are you surprised with the way that they turned out? Were you nervous about them when they began? What could you, I'm sure you have a lot to add on this.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question and kind words about my book. It's such an interesting thing to be kind of a witness to so much reform over those past 10 years. Um, Personally, I've been pretty pleasantly surprised. I'm an anthropologist, and so I don't necessarily look at kind of larger mechanisms of measuring of success of something like decentralization reforms. But by all accounts, based on other people's research and sort of seeing the new opportunities coming out of different communities in Ukraine, due to these decentralization reforms, and also the possibility for people to actually feel more engaged in their communities at different kinds of levels. I think maybe it's not always really explicitly connected to self-organization, right? Because we're talking about actual reform of governing institutions. It's very far from the kind of political organizing that drove the Maidan protests, right? So for me, as someone who came from that perspective, I didn't have a huge amount of positive faith that this decentralization projects would actually functionally do that much for every people's day-to-day well-being and their day-to-day ability to be politically engaged. And I think I was very much wrong about that. And I think that it's great that I was wrong about that. Sometimes anthropologists can be a little too kind of critically focused, right? We
Well,
just
it's
can't
very
really.
rare for any of us to admit that they're wrong about things. So that's impressive. Yeah.
But and it's also honestly, it's seeing research like that, which Alexandra and her team are doing, that really shows, it's not just about things that we can measure based on what laws are being passed and that sort of thing, but how people engage. And so methodologically, focus groups, interviews, and talking to people who work at these different levels, I think it really helps illustrate that. So I think the biggest shout out for me right here is to encourage people to address different types of research, right? To engage with different types and different methodologies of research, because we all show a really different picture. And in particular for me, these questions about IDP integration, it's so important because there were so many people who really talk about feeling disenfranchised after their displacement, useless that the state doesn't need them, these sort of things. And hearing these stories from communities where integration was intentional, and done with some kind of dignity and respect for those folks who were displaced, to kind of give them an economic possibility instead of just assuming that they would rather rely on state benefits or something. It's really heartening to see, especially in the context of full-scale war. It's absolutely remarkable to me.
Yeah, and understanding the contours of those reforms, right? Alexandra, did you have anything to add to that? I'm sure you do.
Yeah, I was listening to your conversation the whole time, and I can also I just can echo Emily and maybe even add some things. I know I sometimes sound so positive, and I've been criticized for that because I always forgot to mention the problems, because I take them for granted. So every society that has to experience internal displacement will have problems with integration, with housing, and so on. And they also make mistakes because, for example, it was very common to set up modular housing, and then municipalities understood, no, it's not good because it's not good for integration. Same thing, they were establishing temporary housing in the schools because everyone thought in 2022 it might end in 2-3 months. And then by September 2022, kids had to go to school, they had nowhere to live. So there are a lot of issues, and it doesn't mean things don't work good, but also let's take, I just came from the city of Zhytomyr, and they have now an investment project where they make a proper housing for in IDPs, which is like a big investment project that they're working with the development bank on that. So they're also trying to solve these problems on their own. And maybe one more thing I want to add to Emily's point regarding self-organization. We actually see some parts of it in having in the cities, towns and villages establishing so-called hubs or community centers. So my colleagues from the KSC Institute, Andriy Darkovich and Miroslava Savisko, Valentin Hatsko, they have done, and Marina Rabinovich, they have done a very good paper on factors of resilience of the communities. And one of the factors that came out is those that had youth centers, community centers, business hubs, whatever other type of self-organized or organized by a municipality places for self-organization, they are generally performing better in resilience. And they measured resilience by their ability to respond to such shocks as internal displacement and electricity outage and similar. So actually these things are connected, and decentralization reform, for me, it gave institutional skeleton for an overall ability of Ukrainian society to self-organize.
Yeah, and you know, the colleagues at KSC have done such remarkable work, you know, over the past several years on this topic, you know, beginning with some of Timothy Brick's work on you know, on the Hromadas in general to understand, and Andriy's work and Marina Rabinovich's together, you know, the corpus of work, both quantitative and qualitative, that has been produced on this topic, to me is quite remarkable. And I do hope that scholars, you know, who are outside of Ukraine really take a very careful look at what's been produced, because it really counters, I think, a lot of conventional wisdom on issues like decentralization, social cohesion, and local governance. But and what's so remarkable about the work that you and Tatiana have done is that it really allows us to get at causal mechanisms, right? So a lot of the survey work that's been done helps us understand what and the relationships and correlations, but your work really helps us understand why. And for public policy, the why is even more important than the what. When you're trying to address something, understanding why it's happened, explaining this is really key. And, you know, just to maybe end things before we open things up to questions, I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about the policy implications of the work that you've done, or are there, if you want to go there. Not everybody does, yeah.
No, we always go there. We think that academia is not impossible without policy expectations, and otherwise why we do this. So one is decentralization is a window of opportunity for positive transformation and even resilience. It is not a guarantee, but it is there, because when we in a crisis, it is always intuitive to centralize, to take the decision making up the levels, because we have an illusion of control. But actually, communities on the ground are able to solve a lot of problems. Obviously, they will not solve the military problem, but they are able to solve all kinds of crises that the war creates. And in fact, municipalities are actually quite active in defense. They support the military units financially and with material goods. So even there it works. So decentralization, window of opportunity. The second is that what we learn is that these diversities, they are, once you create conditions in which people can be belonging and have active belonging to a community, these differences, they become less important. So if on a policy level, you have to actually underline, we are part of this community, and then maybe move up, we are Ukrainians and so on. But this community is very important, that it was sticks people together. And actually, I have to say here the kudos to the National Agency for Corruption Prevention in Ukraine that had a pilot project. They called it Hromada Identity. And you would think, like, where's identity, where's anti-corruption? But actually their theory of change was, once we help cross-sectoral stakeholders to really establish for themselves who we are, what are we doing here and why, there will be less reason for small-scale corruption and even maybe for large-scale corruption. So I think these two things are really what I'm taking with me from this research.
Perfect. Okay, do we want to open things up for questions?
Yeah.
Or maybe Emily, you have some questions before we...
Yeah, I think while you all are in the audience are getting your thoughts together, please do put your questions in the Q&A box. Alexandra, the one population in your types of diversity that you haven't spoken about yet is veterans. And this is a category obviously that already existed in Ukraine before 2022, but of course, as we know, has really skyrocketed in terms of numbers. People who have all kinds of different situations with relationship to their veteran status. We know that veteran integration is going to have to be, or I should say veteran reintegration into civilian life is going to be it already is a huge policy. I don't want to say problem, but challenge, something that the governments have to think about at all these different levels. So maybe you can talk about what your research is showing. I'm sure the conclusions will change over the next months and years. But how do veterans play into this discussion?
So one finding, at least when talking with different communities, also in my policy work, the hromadas, I mean the locals of government, they are very well aware that it is their job to make sure that veterans are part and equal part and respected part of their community, and that they are treated with dignity. So there is a lot of understanding that it's necessary. There's less understanding how we really do it. And we actually looked at a municipality called Makariv. It is located in the Kiev region. And they had a renovation, a complete plan, public discussions of their plan for renovating their park. The municipality has been really damaged by Russian forces. 60% of it households were either damaged, not destroyed, but damaged. So the community, this park was like a way to try to renovate the community, not so much physically, but more like socially, to make people talk to each other. And veterans wanted to have, they had their own vision for this park. And first, as we heard from different stakeholders, there was little willingness to cooperate. So they were like separate. And we should also respect that, I think, is that veteran communities, maybe they want to have a share of distance from other people. Our experiences are really different. And it's okay that maybe you can't just have same integration ways, right? But what the municipality did is they worked together with a group of architects that do use a lot of facilitation methods. And through this cooperation, they were able to talk to the veteran community. And it was conflictual first. But they just said, look, come to events, say, you can say it's bad, right? It's okay also. You can say the project is terrible. And over a year of different conversations with in joint groups and separately, they came to the effect that in the end, they are cooperating with the municipality, and they have established even an informal chat where they have representatives of different groups, so that if municipality has certain ideas, they can run them informally out of these representatives who actually have some legitimacy in the groups they're talking about. So, but if we now zoom out, there is several NGOs that actually working on the issues of, I don't even know how to call it, because I sometimes have to say, it's like, is it integration or reintegration of veterans, or is it reintegration of us who are not veterans? And is it really like, or are we talking about reintegration of community with different experiences? And we shouldn't be talking so much about that they are like coming back to us. We all have to be with them somehow. But I mean, that is more like my citizen position rather than scientific, because we didn't have a very profound research. So it was just part of this study, which we did with Jennifer.
Jennifer, would you like to add anything there?
Yeah, I was just going to ask where you'd want to take this next. Based on what you find, what you found, what questions still keep you up at night? Or, if you can
Yes.
think, I mean, we did this in a very compressed period of time, but if you could, think about the longer term, about what you see as happening inside Ukraine right now. What other kinds of questions would you ask, or what other kinds of questions do you think students out there need to be paying attention to, or some of our colleagues who are also doing work, obviously, in Ukraine?
So I would separate this into themes and mechanisms of change. So of course, if you talk about themes, I think we really need more research on coexistence or even cohesion in terms of religious diversity, because we see a lot of headlines that are rather conflictual, but I think down on the local level, it is not that. It is much more differentiated, and we need to understand it, and we need to really study it. In terms of themes, also we all need to think is how do we prevent that any distributional conflicts that arise because of the war, like housing, like compensations for what kind of losses and so on, they are not being instrumentalized to labels, veteran, non-veteran, Russian speaker, Ukrainian speaker, whatever, that they're not instrumentalized politically for populist purposes to force polarization. It's not there, but I can imagine very easily how technology, social media technology, and others can be used to do that. But in terms of mechanisms, I would really look, and I partially do it already with my team, is how do we constructively talk over our conflict? It's very interesting to see that Ukrainian society is generally not, or maybe it's not just Ukrainian, actually would be my question to you guys, but we don't like conflict. We try to avoid it until it's no more. And then we go on social media, and all of you who read a bit of Ukrainian, Ukrainian social media stuff. So I want to know, how can we do this constructively before it blows up? And currently we work with the Technical University of Berlin. We pilot a citizens assembly. And actually I just returned yesterday from the city of Zhytomyr. We piloted there this format, and it's randomly selected citizens who, through a very structured process of learning and conversation, deliberate about solutions. And currently they chose the topic of transport, which is quite conflictual because it's cars, bikes, rollers, and so on. It's a use of public space, so it's quite conflictual. And we see how people are changing because they came there to say what they want from municipality, and now they're already thinking what is a good solution for all of them in the city, which is a very change of perspective. So I want to have that more, I want to study that more, and want to think about how can we multiply effect of this, what my German colleague, she calls it democratic fitness.
And when we started this project, and sort of the cross-national part was this really interesting confluence of philosophy, economics, and politics. And a lot of this work was motivated by the political philosophy or the political theory of people like John Gray and my colleague Paul Dragos-Alijica, who have been writing on modus vivendi and this concept of live and let live as a potential solution to the increasing migration, technological changes, population changes. We're seeing so many changes in our lives, yet the divisions in our society seem more acute. And this modus vivendi approach, live and let live, is an understanding. And some people say it's pessimistic. I actually see it as sort of optimistic. It sort of takes us down from that democratic, that's pure ideal, but that people are going to have real differences in how they approach lives, their communities, religious differences. Feel like in the, this post, in our liberal moment, in the post World War II, the end of history era, we really forgot about deep differences, and we were almost on this kind of teleological path towards a liberal democracy, and identity sort of fading or becoming less important. And what we've realized is you don't have to be a populist to say identities matter, and they matter in ways that we didn't anticipate. But the modus vivendi approach, along with Elinor Ostrom's and Vincent Ostrom's conceptions of polycentricity create the governance tools that allow individuals and communities to navigate difference from the bottom up rather than from the top down. They recognize that differences are real. Sometimes you cannot overcome them. Sometimes you should not overcome them. And that when you create space for those differences to manifest themselves in different communities, or they don't actually have to be physical communities, even during different online spaces, for example, that this allows for that kind of institutional diversity to flourish. And this could be, from a normative perspective, a potential solution to some of the challenges that we're grappling with. But this is for the philosophers to figure out. And what we tried to do here was really to sort of test some of these claims empirically. Both in the political economy approaches, we see this, but also in the philosophical side. So it's been interesting to see, both in Ukraine, but also in some of the other cases that we're looking at, all of this playing out. So that's sort of just a little bit of the academic background behind the work that Alexandra and Tatiana and the entire team at KSE they've worked on. And we had reading groups together where we're going through some of this literature. Also did some remarkable work with colleagues at the University of Haifa at their Laboratory for Religious Studies, who are working with religious leaders in Israel, post October 7th, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and there are so many in Israel, so many varieties, just like in Ukraine, the varieties of the Orthodox Church. There are so many varieties of Christian churches, Ahmadi groups, Muslim groups, Sunni, you name it. There are so many different groups and so many challenges in bridging those divides. So it's been remarkable to see, actually, during such times of crises, the way that people overcome division in unexpected ways, where so many of us anticipate that there's a kind of helplessness or primordial conflict or never-ending conflict. I think your research really demonstrates the ways that people can be very sensitive to the challenges, and the very political challenges, religious challenges, things that are so close to people's hearts. So I just want to thank you, Alexandra. It was really great to be in Kyiv this summer, to meet with you and the team and some of the research participants who came and shared some really remarkable stories about their experiences. And so often it's this community level that's really neglected. And when we think about war and conflict, always think about geopolitical terms, but the role that communities played in Ukraine, I think, really helped shape geopolitics. Anyway, so thank you so much. I don't know, do we have any questions, Emily?
Yeah, we actually
Okay.
we have a couple that build very much on this discussion. So I'll go ahead and read one of them out. This is Renata Small, who is asking about basically you've talked about decentralization and the examples of the Ukrainian communities at the local level, building a more united, pluralist, and still cohesive governance and coexistence. So do you see these communities as an example for communities that are now in the still occupied oblast to rebuild after the war, and if maybe those places would also be able to become more inclusive communities and societies, even if that means including a Russian minority among their citizens? I mean, I think this last bit is something that, we've talked a lot about different kinds of diversity, and kind of Russian ethnic minority, in addition to Russian language minority, is something to think about in this research as well. So however, either of you or both of you want to address that. Thank you.
Well, I can address that. So I think we need to do additional research in what happens to in the city of Kherson, for example, and it would be good to look more whether the process mechanisms I described is something that can be copy pasted to the temporarily occupied communities today. I don't think so, because we have yet another very strong variable, right? Because there is communities will have to think about how do they deal with collaboration? How do they define collaboration even? there is no unity about it in the Ukrainian society. There are different views, which is normal. It's a democratic society. So I think there will be, and you need to talk about also some sort of reconciliation, and it's a different process. It is not exactly the same. I also want to comment regarding Russian ethnic minority. It's not a factor at all. So we have the ethnic Russian origin is really not a factor in any local relations. Language could be, but also in a specific way. It you know, again, very fresh example. I came from Zhytomyr Citizens Assembly. Some people speak Russian and they are just equally included in the discussions in the small tables as anyone else who speaks Ukrainian. And let's say there is no one who cannot understand each other at this point in time, at least. We will see how it will be, since usage of Russian language is definitely decreasing, and many young people already choose Ukrainian as their language. So I wouldn't call any problems with Russian ethnic minority, and with languages also so far not. We didn't see that this is something that really ignites. And the research I mentioned before from Timofey Brik and the Opora, I really advise you to have a look at it, because you could see that there's no language-based polarization either.
I think this is something to be really optimistic about. Jennifer, feel free to add if you'd like. But I think one of the things that's really important about this research, just as a broader idea about what makes Ukraine interesting, is that there is this perception that Ukraine's kind of divisions are not just ethnic, linguistic, or social, but political too. And that's, many of us who have been doing research in Ukraine for a long time know that that's not true. It's much more complicated and also simpler. And I really like having this data that is going to show that these kind of community-based structures are actually helping people illustrate that these types of divisions are not going to, hopefully not be fault lines in the future. I think that's really wonderful. Having data that we can point to explain why we're making these points is key.
There's also earlier data actually from Odne Oslund and colleagues from Kharkiv Karazin University. They looked at communities in the Kharkiv region, which is ethnically diverse, and it has a lot of Russian speakers in it, and Chernivtsi region, one of the Chernivtsi region communities, which is more like a Romanian minority. And even back in I believe they did it in 2016 or 17, I may not remember correctly, but they had focus groups, and you could also see that people are seeing that they are becoming a community and that these things don't really matter that much.
Yeah. We do have a question from Raymond Arendt about external propaganda. Do we find any evidence of disruptive propaganda from abroad? The specific examples in the questions are from Hungary and Zakarpattia, and of course, Russian propaganda. Is this playing a role in unity and integration in communities at all?
Yes and no. They are not really using ethnic card or anything, but they use other painful subjects like mobilization. And let's say this is where communities can have where social cohesion can be very much let's say diminished, because so Ukraine, on the one hand, Ukraine runs a large-scale mobilization. It is war, and there are cases of misuse of power by the people who are entrusted with doing this. And these cases, they are real, they exist. At the same time, foreign malign influence in Russian, Russian use of social media and so on, they amplified like crazy. It's one thing. Another thing, there is, of course, inequalities and injustice. Some of the our defenders have been there since 2018, and so on. And some of them have been serving for years without a prospect of demobilization. So, of course, it is also creating these painful points which may be misused, and which Russia obviously knows and tries to play this card. In fact, much more than the diversities we are talking about today.
That's really interesting. We also have a question here from Yulia Bidenko, who would like to know about the particular instruments of civic engagement that work better or worse than others in practice. Her examples are petitions, participative budgets, polls, public hearings. I would be interested in any of these, but also if you find any diversity or variation in the different communities that you're researching.
Actually, I think we should invite Yulia Bidenko next time because she has a great deal of she had done a great deal of her own research about this, and she has been also a very active person who has been promoting these tools in Kharkiv. And I actually interviewed her for my PhD work. I hope it's okay that I'm saying it, so we can learn a lot from her work. What I see now is there's nothing that is somehow much better than the other, because there's always different purpose. The electronic petitions are more, to take the steam out, to say things. And if a municipality is smart, they take electronic petitions as a kind of data, as a feedback, and so on. The participatory budget, on the other hand, it is already about self-organization. It is about making a real project for which then the people have to vote. So there's also mobilization, like a voter mobilization, you could say. Most cities actually stopped having a participatory budget because they say it is Ukrainian "ne na chasi," so it is not the right time to do it during the war. Some have done it differently, like the city of Lutsk. They started it again, but they have tweaked it to the situation of war. So they have certain categories for defense and so on. But they work good for creating these communities of people, especially those that write projects. Then, of course, there are claim portals. For example, you can report if something is wrong on the street or so. And I can see that these things have been when they were introduced, they were really active. But if a municipality fails to make it a part of the operational work, responding to it regularly and so on, they sort of wane in their use. But what I can say, in a complex, a lot of participatory tools, they give different people different opportunities. And maybe I also have to say that our colleagues from KSC, they recently did a very big study with 60,000 surveyed people. It was, 60 communities. Yeah, but that makes about that number. So basically, it was a representative survey of 60 communities. So thank you, USAID. And they find that percentage of people who use these things is actually not too high, but in general. But it means that there is a variety of things you can get into, and then it is a channel for people who really want to do something to make a change which is much bigger than their one vote. So one participatory budgeting project in Kiev, for example, resulted in having a library equipped with special reading devices for people who cannot see that well. It's like a way to see the need. Municipality didn't see this need before it became a participatory budget project and people voted for it. So numbers are not that important in this case.
Yeah, and just, to chime in on this, I think it's a really important question. And that, many of these, institutional innovations in public administration, public sector governance, participatory budgeting, all of the kinds of things that Yulia has just described can be quite important. But, from a broader comparative perspective, it's, one of the challenges in the study of public administration in general, and why sort of the field of comparative public administration is almost like moribund, is because it's really difficult to compare this kind of institutional innovation in one context to the next. Fukuyama wrote about this like 20 years ago. There's like what did he say? There's no science of why there is no science of public administration or public organizations, that it's really hard when you have, and this is one of my big criticisms for my friends in public administration. I teach public administration in a policy school. I really enjoy it. But one of the challenges that without taking the political context into consideration, you can't really evaluate or understand the importance of these tools. Like participatory budgeting? What is the the authorizing environment in which these tools operate? And if you can't compare those, and it's looking at the efficiency arguments or the outcomes that these different kind of institutional innovations provide is really, really difficult. So, I mean, one of the interesting things about Ukraine is you can really test those to understand how they work, whether they work. But one of the really important questions I'd ask is who's behind them? Are these donor-supported initiatives? And donors tend to love these kinds of things. The international donors, they can like, let's do participatory budgeting and support it. And they support it, and then the funding is gone, the project is gone, and the innovation is gone. And then, to what extent are the donors behind these things really affects the willingness or the trust that individuals have in whatever institutional innovation is being introduced. So that's what I think is so really different about the Hromada, even as kind of a really important sort of innovation on the institutional side, is that this was introduced by the people through the government, through the Maidan movement. It was kind of a bottom up yet top down solution, I think, as Emily's pointed out, right? But to me, that's like and then this has remained institutionalized, and it is owned by the people of Ukraine. It is a government. And so as we think about a post-conflict reconstruction or reconstruction efforts throughout Ukraine, I think there's a lot of things the rest of the world can be learning from this example that really is counterintuitive and is not practiced in many other places. There's such mistrust of governments by donors because in states that have experienced civil conflict or other kinds of conflict, these institutions are always viewed as very weak, and therefore you need to set up parallel structures to get around them. And we saw this a lot in Ukraine as well over the years. But this is really unique about the Hromada system. And as we think about, hopefully dream about a post-conflict reconstruction and thinking about the future, it's a very different way, a different mechanism to think about what this might look like.
Yeah, and I hope it's okay to say we will probably look at it also together in an edition 2 of our common project. Maybe if I can also jump on this, I just want to give a very empirical example of what Jen says about the Hromadas as institutional solutions. The participatory budget is one single participatory tool which is not mandated in Ukraine by any national legislation. So electronic petitions and other tools, they have sort of a national regulation. Participatory budget is a totally bottom-up. It was brought into Ukraine by PAUSI, which is a Polish-Ukrainian foundation, and they looked it up in Poland. And it completely horizontally moved, and in its best times before the Russian full-scale invasion, a golden rule of thumb was that municipalities gave 1% of their so-called development budget for these projects. And in some municipalities, that would have been really, really good money. And out of these, we also saw in some cities that new political leaders grew and they became members of the local council, for example. So,
Thank you for that detail. It's making me think about several things that I think I'll comment on because we have just a little bit of time left. One of them is this, just again, thinking about things that people don't quite understand properly about Ukraine. So often kind of trust in the presidency or popularity of the presidency is what's pointed at as a show of Ukraine's position or its democracy or the strength of its belief in its institutions or anything like that. And what you are also illustrating, again, with excellent data, I can't impress on the audience enough how excellent and detailed this data is and how important that is, because it really shows that democracy is not just about whether or not we like the person that we elected as president. It's really about these actions at different levels that help people feel like democracy continues to function and also continues to serve them and their needs in a lot of different contexts. I think what we also understand here is that contextually, what democracy means to people at these local levels is very different, and it's making me turn a lens onto the United States. And we have, we hear a lot about local politics being important, but I don't think we think about it as this kind of essential push that we really need to kind of take more advantage of. I suspect that that's because we've had opportunities to have local governance and local governing institutions for a lot longer than Ukrainians have, and so we can kind of look at what's happening in Ukraine. I don't want to say an experiment, but it's sort of it is experimental, let's say. We are creating, possibilities that didn't exist before and seeing how they serve people, and that's what your research also contributes to. And it makes me really, really think about opportunities in other places where we're not talking about newer democracies. We're talking about very long-standing democracies, but where people maybe don't trust that democracy as much anymore. And the big prompt of these comments was this question of trust, right? This comment is, we always talk about, Ukrainians don't trust their government. They don't trust the institutions they have. But I think that's, again, very wrong. There are many institutions and groups and actors within Ukraine that are deeply trusted. And I think, again, all of this research shows that those groups exist. It may not be the presidency. It may not be the highest levels of office, but there's trust and belief in the function of democracy and these different democratic institutions. So you're also giving us a really important illustration of the significance of democracy at many levels. That was not a question. It was much more of a comment.
So I just actually want to jump in here because I just put an article in the chat that about 4 years ago, we wrote a piece with Ilya Murtazashvili and Timofey Milovanov, who many of you know is the president of KSE. And it was about American institutional resilience in the first Trump presidency. And I think there's a lot of important lessons here that we should really stop and reflect on, for a moment, that the United States, I mean, not to get into a political discussion of the United States, because that will never end well. We'll all stop talking to each other or something like that. We talk about this piece about polycentrism, and the federal system of government is like a very robust source of resilience against any kind of populism. And the United States has been through throes of populism throughout its history. This is nothing new. And so, I think that's just really important to understand that waves of politics are quite normal. We should expect it. I think one of the things that we're grappling with, many of us, is this kind of expectation that we all have, is that like history is following this linear trajectory and we're all headed towards this liberal, democratic, market-based utopia. And we know that that wasn't a really good assumption to make. So now we're trying to grapple with the messy reality in front of us. So what is the lesson here? The lesson here from all of this work is that at the local level, people are able to cooperate, people are able to solve problems. They're not always able to do so. There's huge variation in the capacity to do that. Local government has variation in capacity and corruption and many other things. But we shouldn't ever discount the ability of individuals and communities to cooperate when things that matter very much to them are at stake.
If I may, just a quick reflection on two things regarding expectation and the capacity. I can also say from the Ukrainian perspective, imagine we are in the 11th year of the war, we're in the 4th year of the full-scale invasion, and still the citizens also have expectation that there will be electricity, water, energy, and so on. And even though many people have a lot of understanding that, especially in the recent days when there have been an increase in shelling, that there has been a break, in general, there's expectation it's going to be fixed, and actually quite fast, and it is fixed, and people are quite upset and sometimes annoyed. Oh, it is taking us longer, right? So we are here in Ukraine. We have functional institutions with all their downsides, and once you have been outside for some time, you also learn to appreciate that, because it is not so self-evident. Even though in Ukraine you will hear a lot of criticism of the work of municipal authorities. Yeah, Emily knows the critical civil society of Ukraine, but I think it's also our card actually to survive and to progress. And then a second point I want to make about the capacity. So even though today we focus more on things that work, regarding decentralization, there also Ukrainian case gives two questions that we also could then work to answer together. One is research by Natalia Lomonosova. She looks at the social support elderly care. And what we saw in the decentralization reform, that it was done so quickly that the mandate has fallen on local authorities, but the resources haven't. And so now there is a huge number of seniors who need support, and there are social workers who are usually underpaid and understaffed. And it is the job of the mostly local authority to try to find financing for that. And she describes in her research how many of it's usually women who are the last line of social support in the municipalities, and they are doing it for years on very low payment. And she even asks whether this is resilience or survival. And these are really good questions we have to talk, and like when decentralization reforms are made. And another one is that resilience of Ukrainian society is amazing, but it is also not endless, and we must not take it for granted. Ukrainians are not made of steel, and there's a very informative research of Sophie Lambroskini, who looks at the water utility, and she looked at Voda Donbasu. It's a water utility in the Donbas region, and there is a moment when shelling and hostilities become so tense that you cannot fix the pipes anymore and you cannot provide the water and so on. So with that said, even though we hail Ukrainian resilience, we also must know it needs support. And when we talk about the need for air defense, the need for sanctions on Russia, the need for especially European, some sort of military union, that is also because you can't only expect Ukrainians to be resilient endlessly on the frontiers of systemic war, basically, between authoritarianism and democracy.
Thank you so much for that. Especially, we've had a very telling experience just this evening about why these are still necessary.
It's over.
Everyone's relieved to know. We do have one final question from Tatiana Kavanagh that I'll go ahead and ask about institutional arrangements that are necessary to monitor the financial practices of community level initiatives in a decentralized system. Can you tell us anything about what these institutional arrangements are, how monitoring of finances works, and how is there a balance between those monitoring, the necessary kinds of monitoring, and preserving local autonomy and promoting social participation?
So there is, we have a Prozoro. So let's say there are many different ways of monitoring depending on what. If you want to monitor public spending, Ukraine has a procurement system called Prozoro, and it is public. So anyone can actually look what is your municipality buying, and you can go and ask questions. Then we have Ukraine, as part of its anti-corruption work, there is asset declaration system. So every public official, including local officials, they have public asset declarations. Again, you can monitor as a citizen. Obviously, Ukraine has a state audit service, which has been very strict normally, and also monitors. We have very strong civil society, and I can also name, even though it has been, you have to know, a lot of monitoring watchdog civil society representatives are actually now in the armed forces of Ukraine. So there is now a question, how can we raise a new generation, younger people and there is a Ukrainian anti-corruption NGO called Mezha, who is currently training, constantly have certain schools for regional, for people in the regions to be able to monitor their authorities, monitor procurement and other things. Plus, Ukraine has a very developed system of open data. Usually big cities have open data portals, smaller cities, it is harder for them to do it, but there are certain data sets that are have to be actually open even during the war. And even as a researcher, I sometimes ask myself, do we really need that much transparency? But it's maybe another conversation. So yes, there are ways to monitor it, both by the state and by civil society. And of course, the system DREAM is a very big system of monitoring and reporting reconstruction projects. Now it's being repurposed for the new so-called PIM, Public Investment Management System, and all recovery reconstruction projects will be there, either funded by the partners or by the state. Doesn't matter, it all will be there.
Which is a huge call for all of us to think more systematically with this field, which is known as comparative public administration or public governance. So often this field doesn't really speak so much to political science and economics. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities for us to really sort of work in this direction. Alexandra and her team have just done such incredible work, and I just want to thank them for being such beautiful partners in this.
And thank you very much for being our beautiful partner.
And thank you all. We'll join on the thank you train for being with us this afternoon, Boston time, to talk about this important work, and I hope that it continues. And so I thank each of you, Jennifer, Emily, and Alexandra in particular, under what I'm sure are daily trying circumstances, but was very, I think, useful to remind our watchers of what the Ukrainians are still dealing with. So thank you all for joining us. We have another event coming up on Monday, November 17th on Ukrainian resilience. And I put the link in the chat, but you can also go to the Davis Center website or the HURI website to find more information. And until then, take care. Thank you.